I have been going down the rabbit hole that is the Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt drama true crime case since the story broke in August of 2023. I was never somebody who watched the 8 Passengers channel prior to that. I had heard about it a little bit when everything kind of blew up with it coming out that Chad had been sleeping on a beanbag for several months. I had loosely heard of the family, but it was in August that the story really captured me. And one of the questions that I immediately had was, where is the father and why is the father not in trouble? And in the last over a year of being interested in the story, I've seen so many people comment versions of that same question over and over and over again on all kinds of articles and videos and Reddit threads and different things talking about this story. Is what about Kevin?
So I don't recall the exact time, but sometime before 11 o'clock today, we received a phone call from 911 on our dispatch that a 12 to 13-year-old boy was knocking on doors in a neighborhood asking for food and water, that he was severely emaciated, that he had...
What does emaciated mean?
Skinny, scrawny, malnutrition, not enough food, not enough water to sustain life. So he had...
I'm sorry, what?
He had duct tape on his extremities, on his hands, on his ankles, and those were covering rope burns that were used to tie him down. Take a second and think about what I just said. That's the condition of your son. Given that information, your son was taken to the hospital. A warrant has been applied and granted by the Department of Child and Family Services to remove. So no one right now is going to have access to these 2 children based on their physical condition. Do you understand that?
I understand.
Would you condone that behavior?
Would I condone that behavior?
That's my job. My job is to find out your knowledge of the treatment of these
based on
precious
your description,
children.
No. Again, I don't know the details, or I don't know what's going on. But as you described that sounds
Horrible. Disgusting. No human being should be treated like that.
Okay.
That's my thoughts. But again, we might be different on that. We're going to sit here for a second, okay? We're going to go out and talk. I'm not saying you're still not free to go. Are you under arrest? Absolutely not. We just have lots of questions that we need to figure out. Lots. Okay?
Okay, because...
Your children are under medical care right now.
And what does that mean?
And it means that you don't have access to them. My understanding is that they are... What is that?
They're in the custody of DCFS.
And they will be for the next 70...
There's a medical hold on them right now. So for at least the next 72 hours, based on our understanding.
At least the next 70.
They're in observation. They're being watched.
DCFS is going to provide you that information, and they can better answer your questions along those lines. That's handled through them. Okay? So we'll be back.
So I want you to think about some things, though.
I don't know.
Listen to me. Listen to me. I want you to think about that for a minute. Don't have no idea where they're at.
Oh, I don't either. But,
Okay, we're going to hop out here. We'll be back in a minute, okay? That's still recording audio and video, okay? So if you would, don't make any phone calls.
sure.
And now that this new documentary on Hulu came out, Devil in the Family, I honestly was hoping that this new documentary would give us insight into what was going through Kevin's head in a way that would really help things make sense and that would maybe even make me warm to him a little bit more than I had. And I've watched the 3 episodes and that didn't happen for me. But I know that I've been really fixated on this story for a long time. So let me back up and go into more detail for people who might be newer to this than I was. Let's break down what Kevin knew about Ruby and what his children were experiencing at the hands of his wife while 8 Passengers was still on YouTube. Something that I think is important to note is that the 8 Passengers YouTube channel had not been active for roughly a year before. I'm going to call him R, by the way. I know everybody pretty much knows all of the kids' names, but these children obviously have had their lives largely exploited for years, and I've seen a lot of other people referring to the 4 minor children by their initials instead of their full name, so I'm gonna join in with doing that. So it had been roughly a year since 8 Passengers had posted any new content before R escaped and this news, broke out. And that was also roughly the same amount of time that Kevin had been separated from Ruby. So I think that's important. That was something that most people, when the news first broke, weren't aware of, was that they had not been in contact for a year. So that's, of course, a significant part of the answer to where was Kevin. He wasn't with Ruby. He wasn't in Ivan's. He wasn't at Jodi's home while the worst of the worst was happening.
Since they lived here in the city of Ivans, have you communicated with your wife regarding discipline with your kids or their care or their physical well-being?
No.
So is she doing this on her own and just telling you how your kids are?
She's not telling me anything about the kids.
Who's this female Jodi that your wife lives with? Do you know a female named Jodi?
She is a therapist and a life coach, I know. And she's...
Do you respect her?
Do I respect her?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think she's a very honest, truthful person, yes.
Okay. You place value on Jodi?
I don't know what that means.
Do you value what she says and how she treats? Is your wife a client of hers? Is your wife a partner of hers? Is your wife a roommate with her? Your kids are living in her house is what I'm trying to say.
I'm not aware of that, but I know that they've been in business for the last year filming.
Who's they?
Ruby and Jodi. They
Ruby
film
and Jodi's in business.
podcasts, and so every week a podcast goes up and I listen to it.
But a lot of people felt for years that their YouTube channel was publishing videos that showed really concerning parenting practices. A lot of people were calling it abuse. They had people calling CPS based on content that was being publicly posted to YouTube when Kevin was still with Ruby. So what did he definitely know? He definitely knew that the kids were not allowed to eat as a punishment sometimes, or that dinner or food was a privilege in their household. There is a clip I found on TikTok of an old vlog where she says very openly that the kids are going to lose their dinner privileges if they don't like immediately listen to her. It's not clear if Kevin is in the home, like in the room during that clip, but I would assume that anything that was posted publicly on their YouTube channel could not have been terribly hidden from him.
And go eat right now. Get up and go eat. They're gonna think you're torturing him. Stop it. I know you're not, but it looks like you are. I'm only gonna say it one more time, and then you're gonna lose the privilege to eat dinner.
But more than that, I've also read Sherry's book, The House of My Mother, which is a great read. I would definitely recommend buying it and reading it to anybody interested in this story. It's really, really insightful and very well written. Sherry mentions how when she was 5, so this is well before the 8 Passengers vlogging channel started, one night Ruby had made chicken Alfredo, which Sherry really did not like, and so she wasn't eating it, and Ruby wasn't willing to let her eat anything else and was trying to make her go hungry. And Kevin snuck her a bowl of ice cream under the table. Now, I guess that goes to show that he didn't entirely believe in using that as a punishment. However, he clearly knew that his wife was attempting to use that as a punishment, and snuck something to his child rather than confronting his wife that, hey, let's not make our kid go hungry. Something that I find very confusing about this whole story where Kevin is concerned is the physical abuse. In Sherry's book, she makes it clear that Ruby would do things like flick her in the lips, slap her face, would just be physical, use physical parenting methods, which, granted, of course, some people are going to say are not abuse, but research on child well-being and trauma and so on completely disagree with that. And the way that Sherry makes it sound is that physical punishment was very normal for Ruby in her household well before Jodi, well before 8 Passengers even. And so my assumption was that Kevin knew about that. It seems like he must have known that Ruby was spanking the kids, slapping the kids, etc. However, I did see an interview that Kevin and Chad did where Kevin says that most of the physical violence was hidden from him, which I found interesting for multiple reasons. One, I thought it was interesting that he chose to call it physical violence rather than abuse. And two, he said most. So he, in my opinion, is admitting that he knew there was some physical violence. For this documentary, the Franke family turned over some sort of like computers or hard drives or something that had a lot of vlog footage on them that had never gone into the vlogs, like the unedited versions of things. And some of that was shown in the documentary. And one of those clips was where Ruby is trying to film, and I'm pretty sure it was the youngest, E, started talking, they're like sitting at a table, started talking while Ruby was in the middle of trying to film, and Ruby yells at her and grabs her and like roughly puts her hand over the child's mouth and kind of makes her get down. And the way that she grabs her and puts her hand over her mouth just seemed really rough, kind of made me feel unsettled in my stomach. And then from behind the camera, you see these fingers come up and Kevin says, "Cut." So he was filming this. And so I think that's a very clear example that he knew that she was very roughly handling the kids at bare minimum. And he made a joke out of it, frankly. So my gut feeling is that he was really okay with a lot of the physical discipline and like physical roughness, and perhaps doesn't see that as abuse even if he didn't participate in it.
And during your marriage, how was disciplining your kids? How would you discipline your kids?
I'm not going to answer that question.
Kevin very clearly knew that Ruby screamed at the children very frequently. There are multiple scenes in this documentary. I think at least 2 are even in the trailer for this documentary, so even if you don't have Hulu and can't see the whole thing, you can see a couple of examples where Ruby is just really screaming. And at least in the full version of the documentary, you can then hear Kevin speak too. At one point, she's screaming that she's still filming and why is there so much noise? And then you hear Kevin's voice answer her that it's, I don't remember what he said, 12:35 and we're getting ready for church. That's why there's noise or something like that. The other one is a scene where she's trying to get all of the children to sit on the couch, presumably for filming or for a photo or something. And the little one isn't sitting still and she screams, "Sit her down on the flippin' couch," but says it much more aggressively than that. And then after a brief second, you hear Kevin repeat it much more calmly, like, "Get her seated on the couch," or something like that. So he without a doubt knew that she was regularly speaking to her children in a really aggressive manner. It's very clear from the vlogs that he knew Chad wasn't allowed in his bedroom for, I think it was 7 months. And after that blew up, he did some interviews kind of trying to defend their decision, as did Ruby. So clearly he was on board with their child's bedroom being a privilege or his bed being a privilege. He clearly knew that Chad was sent to this wilderness camp and was on board with that.
Chad today has just entered the Anasazi Foundation Wilderness Therapy Program, where he's going to spend the next 8 to 10 weeks living in the
Anasazi Desert.
Yeah, the desert mountain.
He knew that the 2 youngest children, who I believe would have been 7 and 9, something like that, were not allowed any presents at Christmas, the last Christmas that they vlogged. And he is in a video that was put on the Connections group, basically justifying that and explaining that and implying that that is what like actual loving parenting is. There is a old vlog where the Ruby and some of the children are in their van and get in a car accident. Nobody is seriously injured, but there's at least 2 other cars that were involved in this, and it's scary, of course. She has to pull over. R is crying a lot. He very clearly was shaken up. Everybody seems shaken up, really. But they're all relatively okay. And then Ruby kind of calls all of the children to attention to say something along the lines of, "We should have been hurt in this car accident, but, God watches out for us," or something to that effect. And to me, that's pretty clear psychological abuse, using a very frightening, potentially even somewhat traumatic experience to kind of weaponize the idea of being religious. Just really, really unsettling.
I think he's okay. This tire blew. It looks like the tire blew.
Okay.
And was I right behind him? I don't even remember what happened. I'm shaking.
Are they okay?
Everyone's okay. We should have been in that crash. I don't know how we avoided getting hit, but you know what? There is not a single scratch on our car. There is not one person who got whiplash. And do you know why? It's because we said our prayers this morning.
Along those same lines, I can't know for sure if Kevin knew all of the details of this, but in Sherry's book, she talks about how Chad once played a prank on her by cutting her hair while she wasn't looking, like snipping part of her hair. And Sherry knew that if Ruby knew what had really happened, that Chad would be in huge trouble. And so she tried to protect Chad from Ruby, but Ruby found out and then in return gave him a reverse mohawk, intentionally bad haircut, as punishment for having cut Sherry's hair. And to me, using hair cutting as a tool of shame or to change somebody's identity is just one of those things that always gives psychological abuse vibes and even cult vibes. After R escaped, when they found E, her hair had been shaved. So they actually thought that she was a boy when they first found her because of her hair. So to me, it seems like Ruby has always had these pretty extreme disciplinary tactics. They were just made much worse once Jodi got into the picture. And it's just hard for me to think that Kevin could have come home from work with Chad having this dramatically different haircut and wouldn't have been told the story of how this was his punishment. When trying to look at how Kevin was okay with all of this, that he did know, a lot of my mind goes to how does Mormonism factor into this? I think that people who are not at all familiar with the LDS Church, aka Mormonism, may find a lot of these things to be more extreme than some people who see bits and pieces of these things in the Mormon Church. In the description box, I'll link to a Reddit thread where somebody was talking about being a student of Kevin's. If you're not familiar, he was a professor at BYU, which is a Mormon university. The moderators of this Reddit vetted this person as being a true student of Kevin's, like they're not just making this up. The student said that while all of the professors at BYU are very strictly Mormon, and it's very clear that Kevin was the most devout professor that they had. And part of why he felt that way was that he baked a devotional into every lesson that he taught while a professor, which most of the other professors did not do. So I think just right off the bat, understanding that this is a pretty devout Mormon man is key. The LDS Church teaches essentially traditional gender roles. The role of husbands and fathers is first and foremost to provide for their family. The role of women is to devote their lives to motherhood. They are a very family-centered religion. It's not just that you're supposed to have kids, but you're supposed to have big family. The mother specifically is supposed to really make motherhood her number one priority in life. Not a career, not anything else. Family life is where women are supposed to find their glory in Mormonism. I'll link this in the description as well, but a small passage that expresses this on the official LDS website is, by divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness, and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. Mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of the children. In these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers are obligated to help one another as equal partners. Disability, death, and other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. Extended families should lend support when needed. And this idea of equality is referenced in other places on the LDS website, which at times I think people kind of try to twist to say, oh, they're not really for traditional values, they really are feminist. But my understanding is that that really isn't the case. It really is this idea of equality, like different but equal. So it's not that women can work and fathers can stay home equal. It's you stay home and take care of the kids and he goes to work and you're both equally taking care of the children. You're both equally of value to God and to your communities. I don't necessarily think of that as like true equality, but that's kind of the language that they like to use. Another aspect that I think is really key to understand from the LDS Church is that they really utilize language related to addiction and compulsion a lot more than you might see in other cultures. A lot of LDS churches actually have these recovery support groups right in their churches. And most frequently, these are for sex addiction or porn addiction. The LDS Church has really strict ideas of what healthy sexuality is. They are extremely anti-porn, extremely against sex or other romantic or sexual interactions like making out or things like that are often considered to be very sinful prior to marriage. A popular belief in the LDS Church is that sexual sin is second only to murder. And sexual sin is not interpreted to exclusively be rape, which, I think outside of Mormonism, a lot of people might say rape is the worst thing you can do, second only to murder. But they consider sexual sin to be premarital sex, to be looking at porn. I have seen interviews from some LDS or former LDS members who talk about how their church or their bishop, their family defined porn as not necessarily what mainstream culture would consider porn, but anything that might arouse an erotic feeling in somebody. Something like a advertisement for a bikini. If a man or boy were to look at that ad in a magazine or on a billboard, or to walk past Victoria's Secret and to see a poster or something, and had any sort of emotional or physical reaction to that whatsoever, then that could be considered having looked at porn. So it does not have to be utilizing X-rated website or X-rated magazines or movies. And because of that, and because any amount of engagement with porn or any sexual activity outside of marriage is considered to be a sexual sin and one of the worst sins people can do, then a lot of times these men, well, usually men at least, get labeled as having a porn addiction or a sexual addiction when they might literally have looked at porn once or twice a month. Also, self-pleasure is not acceptable either. And so that is another way that people get labeled as having an addiction, is if they are experiencing self-release. And so the vast majority of boys and men prior to marriage especially tend to be made to believe that they have a sexual addiction, when often their behavior, when looked at by like most people who are like therapists, for example, would not see the behavior as problematic. And the current DSM does not list sexual addiction as a disorder. My understanding is that most modern therapists think that most anything can become a harmful behavior, but there are specific guidelines that are looked at to see if something is harming your functioning, essentially. So it would be if your behaviors are impacting your marriage or your family, if your behaviors are impacting you at work, if they are harming your finances, things like that. Kind of the same sort of questions that you might ask yourself if it's like, am I gambling for fun, or is my gambling a problem? If you find yourself getting on gambling apps at work, that's a sign of a problem. Kind of the same thing with sex addiction or porn addiction, according to most therapists, in my understanding. I'm not a therapist, by the way, but I am a therapy nerd, so I love to do armchair psychology, but do keep in mind it is very much armchair. Anyway, it is my belief that a lot of Mormons are made to believe that they have a sexual addiction or a porn addiction when it is not something that is impacting their family or their marriage or their finances, their job, etc. But because there is so much abstinence and so much repression of sexuality that is pushed in the LDS culture, a lot of times they perceive themselves as having a problem. So with all of that in mind, I think is a really critical piece for understanding how and why Jodi was able to convince Kevin, to convince Chad, and to convince so many other Mormon men that, or boys and men, that she was a therapist for, that they were an addict, and to get them to join a addiction-based men's group despite not really having an addiction. I'm a huge fan of the Mormon Stories podcast that's available here on YouTube. They interview LDS and former LDS members frequently, and they sometimes have a therapist on there who will talk about various issues in the LDS church and kind of compare them to modern psychology. But also the guy who runs Mormon Stories has the same degree. He's not like a practicing therapist, but he has the education of one. And it's just really insightful, and they frequently talk about the kind of really sexual trauma that occurs to both genders, but maybe especially men, when it comes to being convinced that they have a real sexual problem, when the vast majority of the time it really is not something that would be called a sexual addiction in any other part of culture. And I guess I should add here, I think that there are definitely a lot of sexual traumas or sexual issues that the women end up with as well. It's just different. They're not labeled as addicts. Another piece that I think is really key to understand about Mormonism is Mormonism believes in the idea of fasting as a way to get closer to God. LDS people are encouraged to fast one Sunday every month. On those days that they fast, they will then give testimony as well, which kind of further reinforces this connection between going without food and getting more in touch with God. I'll link an article below from the official LDS site that talks about their beliefs on fasting. I couldn't find anything about this on the official LDS site, but from Googling things related to corporal punishment in Mormonism, it was very, very normalized in past generations, at least. I've found multiple things on Reddit where people were saying that in like the 70s and 80s, their family had a paddle like intended for beating your children with that was produced by BYU. So the university actually made spanking paddles, and a lot of families used those on their children. It's my belief that it takes a long time for cultures to really change. So even if the church were now to come out and say we shouldn't use physical punishment on our children, we're just, 1 to 2 generations out from the 70s and 80s. And so if people who were parented that way are now parenting their own children, a good percentage of them are going to use very similar parenting practices to how they were parented. And I think that that would still, in my opinion, be a legacy of their culture, even if their official recommendations have changed. I think it's just to be expected that it takes a while to really filter out changes like that. Mormonism really believes in documenting your everyday life. Now, traditionally, this is encouraged through journaling. So a lot of LDS members keep a journal or a diary type of thing where they just document their day-to-day life every day for years. I've seen actually some really cool, in my opinion, videos where people are talking about how they have a dozen or more journals from their mother or their grandmother or others who documented their daily lives their whole life. And I think there's something a little bit cool about that. But I think that that plays into the story in 2 ways. One, I think it's a key part of why Ruby kept her journal, where she was writing about what she was doing to her children, which in this case was a really beneficial thing because she really told on herself. You really can see her admitting to lots of bad things in those journals. But second, in Sherry's book, The House of My Mother, she references how that is why family vlogging is so popular in LDS families. is vlogging can be kind of this modernized way to document your daily life. So it really is kind of the modern journaling. And on top of that, they also believe that part of their job is to bring more people to the LDS Church. And so if they can use this public platform that encourages, or at least like somewhat references, positive things about the LDS Church and has the potential to draw more people to the church, then they are being really great Mormons for vlogging on top of documenting their life and potentially making good money off of it. I have seen videos from LDS people talking about whether or not possession, or the belief of possession, is normal in mainstream Mormonism. I have seen people argue both sides of this. I have seen people say, absolutely, I grew up Mormon and we definitely talked about possession, people being possessed, and it was a very normalized thing. And I have seen other people say that I grew up LDS and I had never heard of this, and I didn't know that any LDS people believed that. So it does seem to be somewhat divided. However, in Sherry's book, Sherry said, this is a quote, "We firmly believe in Satan's power and ability of his legion of fallen spirits to possess individuals. We believe that evil can inhabit physical forms, sometimes fleetingly and sometimes for extended periods. Having been raised to believe the very air I breathed was thick with unseen forces battling for dominion over my soul, it was a small step for my young mind to imagine that battle raging in my own bedroom." At least from Sherry's perspective, her family very much pre-Jodi believed in possession and in the ability for spirits to possess people. And I think that is something that is important to understand with this whole story, because it makes the idea of Jodi becoming possessed and of the children becoming possessed it doesn't require such a leap as it would for me, for example, as I didn't grow up believing in possession. And so I think the way that Jodi's various beliefs kind of took some of these aspects of Mormonism and extended them a step is important to understand, because it's just less of a leap than is needed for people who didn't have some of these beliefs from their church to begin with, or from their family culture to begin with. Kind of part 3 here. Let's move a little bit forward in the timeline. What did Kevin know during the spring and the summer of 2023? So for reference, this would be the time period where the 2 youngest children were being the most severely abused. R was found, I think it was August 30th, but it was definitely late August 2023. So what did Kevin know in the spring and summer leading up to? Kevin knew that Chad was only 17 and still in high school and had been kicked out of the family home, and that he was not to talk to the family and he wasn't able to talk to his dad. He knew that Ruby was taking basically all of her cues from Jodi. He knew this well before the spring and summer of 2023. Even while Kevin and Ruby were still living together, Kevin was well aware that Ruby was essentially eating out of Jodi's palm.
I knew that the only way I would ever get back into my house was I had to get Jodi's approval. If I didn't get Jodi's approval, I would never get Ruby's approval.
Kevin has stated that the decision to take Chad's bedroom away and to send him to the wilderness camp were all really based on Jodi suggesting those things. So he knew that their parenting choices were really coming from Jodi at that point. And that was pretty far in advance to spring of 2020.
All the stuff she did with Chad was because of Jodi.
The news about Chad having slept on a beanbag for 7 months really broke in around June of 2020. So even that far back, Kevin knew that their parenting decisions largely were coming from Jodi. And so then we're talking almost 3 full years later. Prior to spring and summer of 2023, Kevin knew that Jodi believed she was experiencing possession, and also knew that she believed herself to be having religious visions that needed to be documented for later use. It wasn't said quite this explicitly, but my interpretation of some of what he has said is essentially they were writing down her visions with the intent that she would someday have like a new version of her own Bible, that she would be, that she was a very major religious figure, and that what was happening to her would be in a very important book someday.
Then she started having like trances and stuff. I would say probably September, where she believed that she was going to heaven and seeing God and Jesus and talking with them. And she would get together with Pam Botcher. Ruby, Pam, and Jodi would get together and do these interventions. That's what they called them. And so they'd just go up and lock themselves in a room for 4 or 5 hours, and then they'd come out and they'd all just be on cloud nine, and Ruby would share with me like she had this amazing vision, and I wrote it and recorded it all down, and we have a work to do from God, and you're part of it, and the bishop's part of it, and we're all part of bringing all this stuff to the world.
Prior to spring of 2023, he knew that Jodi wanted to be given the 8 Passengers YouTube channel and the 8 Passengers brand. He knew this in July of 2022. And he knew that the 8 Passengers longtime manager called this out. When the manager learned that Ruby was considering giving over the 8 Passengers brand and channel to Jodi, he's like, this is a scam. You're being taken advantage of. I highly recommend against doing this. And Kevin agreed with the manager that that seemed like a really bad idea. And he knew that Ruby was dead set on it and thought that this was a way to like show her loyalty to God.
So basically the contract was Ruby gives Jodi everything and Ruby gets nothing in return. Our manager, our YouTube manager at the time was like, red flags, like I don't know how to tell you, she is scamming you. Ruby fired him. And I was like, I believe our manager, I think he's right, and Ruby started threatening me with another separation.
I want to talk a little bit about brainwashing. Now, again, I'm not a therapist. This is all armchair psychology. When looking at a true crime case where there is somebody who sees themselves as essentially some sort of prophet, and everybody's calling this a cult, right? And so usually brainwashing is part of that conversation. On one hand, I think that the idea of brainwashing, and also just kind of like cult mentality, or how cults get people to believe things that seem extremely illogical to anybody not in the cult, I think that is a really tough thing for most of us to wrap our heads around if we haven't experienced it. And I certainly haven't experienced anything like that. And so at times I see myself just like shaking my head. And then I also try to pause and think like, am I just not being empathetic enough? Do I just not have the level of understanding of psychology that I would need to have in order to understand how this could happen? I try to like hold that on one hand. And some things I've watched that have given me a little bit better insight into how powerful Jodi was on getting people to believe things and getting them to do things that they would not have ordinarily done is to watch content related to other victims of Jodi's. Some great ones to look up on YouTube if you have not seen them are the Mormon Stories episodes with Jodi Hildebrandt, that's Jessi, and Adam Paul Steed. Adam Paul Steed's interview on Mormon Stories was taken down off the official channel, but I have seen it elsewhere, so if you are a little bit clever, you might still be able to find it. But those two accounts, but there are also other victims of Jodi's. There are other people who were members of her like men's addiction groups who have come out, members of Connections who have come out. I haven't found as much long form content from anybody other than Adam and Jesse, but those two stories are great and really speak to the fact that there was something about Jodi that really got a lot of people to trust her and to give her a lot of power. Another one would be Paige Hannah has done a few videos on YouTube as well. Hers didn't, I think she stayed a little vague, didn't get as close to the chest as the other two interviews did. But it's interesting to see people who seem highly intelligent and highly empathetic and just very much like ordinary people who, to varying degrees, trusted Jodi for some period of time before eventually realizing that this was a really bad situation. Something I've thought about a lot with Kevin in particular is how much was he genuinely brainwashed versus how much did he just lack a backbone? Because that's kind of how it really, I think, comes off to a whole lot of us, that at the end of the day, he didn't take care of his kids. And sure, at least I fully believe that he wasn't with Jodi and Ruby in the spring and summer of 2023. So he didn't see his children, the two littles, that he didn't see them losing all of this weight, and he didn't see them being tied up and with this duct tape and with these wounds around their hands and wrists. However, he really was a very absent, highly negligent parent by just saying, I'm just gonna step away from this family. Most of us think, like, you can't leave your children with two monsters and then say, well, I wasn't there to see it. Yeah, you weren't there to see it. You didn't know every last detail. And I think there's probably a lot that he really truly didn't know. However, I can't wrap my head around how he could have thought that Ruby was a good mom or that Jodi was a good therapist. And it only makes sense, to me at least, to say, well, I trusted my children to be cared for by my wife if your wife has a history of showing you that she is a good mom. And I don't see any evidence of that. That's just my opinion. Chad did say in the documentary that he thought when he was little that she was a good mom. My interpretation of Sherry's book is that she didn't outright say this, but that she wouldn't have ever thought that her mom was a good mom. She talks about not being consoled from babyhood on. So I don't know. I just don't get it. A passage from Sherry's book that speaks to him potentially just lacking a backbone more so than being brainwashed, in my opinion. This was in reference to when this was after 8 Passengers had started and Sherry was really struggling with her mental health. And more specifically, she was struggling with ideation. I don't remember if she told Kevin about this or if he found out. I think she actually told him. And it was made pretty clear to me from the book that while Kevin was never going to get Parent of the Year award from Sherry, that he was clearly the safer of her two parents, and she definitely had some stronger connection with him. It was just perhaps very fleeting or very occasional that she could experience safety through him, but it was sometimes there, whereas it was never there with Ruby. It was my read of her, what she was saying about her from her book. Anyhow, related to when she was experiencing ideation and wanted to see a therapist. This is a quote. "But Kevin surprised me. 'No,' he said firmly. 'We should let her see a therapist. This is serious, Ruby.' Ruby's face flickered with shock, then hardened into stubborn resistance. But Kevin stood his ground, quiet determination in his eyes that I'd rarely seen before. I retreated to my room, curling up in my bed, listening to my parents argue about my mental health. My pain was real, I knew that, and for once, it seemed, at least Kevin was really seeing me. really seeing me. That small realization felt like hope somehow. My interpretation of this is Sherry was somewhat surprised that when her life was theoretically on the line, that her father was willing to stand up to Ruby and say, no, she needs help. And on one hand, it seemed that it made a significant difference in Sherry's life that he did stand up, and it made an important moment in their relationship for her to see that at times when it's really essential, my father will stand up for me. And how terribly sad is it that she was surprised by this? How much does that speak to how much her father didn't speak up in the vast majority of situations that were less extreme, perhaps? Another thing that, in my opinion, speaks to Kevin kind of just lacking a backbone in general is in the document, he stated that he was very insecure as a young man and that he was willing to change to become somebody that somebody else would appreciate and love. And that's an exact quote. He also tells this story of how when he was starting to somewhat date Ruby, but they weren't like exclusive, she had a poster that she had taped in her closet that was kind of like a spreadsheet that she had made. And it listed all of these different traits that her like ideal husband would have. And then in the columns, it listed these different men that she was considering staying with. And she was like marking off which of these men had which of these traits. Like kind of very clearly like ranking them or grading them to see which one met most of these traits the best. And he said that he studied that list of the traits that she most wanted in men, and it included both physical and like spiritual personality traits, all kinds of different things. That he studied it and attempted to just become everything that she wanted. And that's how he won out from these other like 4 or 5 men that she was also considering, is that he literally just studied her list of ideal traits and tried to morph into that. Now, while I've just been using the word spineless, I also want to be a little bit more empathetic and talk about what do I really mean by that? What I really mean by that is that he may have a personality makeup or wiring that might make him overly accommodating, maybe a people pleaser, maybe codependent. And part of what Sherry's book talks about is how once she got into therapy with a good therapist, she learned that she defaults to a fawn trauma response, and that this is how she was trying to keep herself safe as a child from Ruby, was to appease Ruby and to essentially be the good kid as much as she could. And that this earned her a lot of negative feedback from viewers who called her Little Ruby, and they kind of saw her as a goody two-shoes or something like that. And it was never that she actually admired Ruby or wanted to be everything Ruby wanted her to be. It was that she was fawning. She was trying to keep herself safe through being what her mother wanted her to be, or what would cause the least tension with her mother. And getting a little overly personal here, but I fawn as well. And I struggle with some of the same coping methods of people pleasing and being really afraid of conflict and probably biting my tongue too much and not using my voice enough and things like that. And so for the vast majority of people, I can have a lot of empathy for where these tendencies come from. And I wouldn't typically call these people spineless, myself included, because I think that we adapt these things for a reason. However, I also think that regardless of what your kind of default coping methods are, when things get ugly enough, everybody has to draw a line in the sand, especially once you're an adult, especially when you have children to protect. And I think that Sherry herself is a wonderful example of this. Sherry is, I think, roughly 10 to 12 years younger than me, but I want to be Sherry when I grow up. Sherry is a great example of how somebody can have a brain that was wired from a young age to try to people please and try to not make waves, and then who found herself in situations that just really contradicted her actual values, and so she found ways to stand up for what was right, even though that really went against her fawning. Sherry, in my opinion, has spoken up so much more to Kevin and Ruby, who she calls Kevin and Ruby, by the way. She does not call them mom and dad anymore. And in her book, there is another middle-aged or past middle-aged couple that she calls mom and dad now. So I think that really speaks to, while she is in touch with Kevin, she is not in a really great place with him. But anyway, Sherry, despite being prone to fawning, really stood up to both of her parents. She tried doing this quite early on. She tried to bring it to the family's attention that Jodi Hildebrandt had lost her license for really unethical therapy practices. Sherry shares a few stories between the documentary and the book where she tried to look out for her younger siblings in subtle ways, even while still a minor, and not really being able to really change anything in a more significant way. Like I shared earlier with the situation where Chad had cut her hair, she tried to protect him from Ruby still. And there are also stories of where Kevin kind of did that. Kevin kind of tried to protect the kids, but not from a parent place. He was acting as if he was a fellow child, like giving them food under the table rather than talking to his wife. So while I say that Sherry pushed back, Kevin did in the same kind of ways, but the difference being he was an adult. So he didn't need to use these same tactics that Sherry used as a child. And so that's the difference. I can really respect Sherry for these things, especially while she was still a minor. And I just don't give Kevin as much credit because he was an adult. So he had so much more power than what Sherry did. In her book, she pushes back against certain things about the LDS Church, even though from everything I could piece together, she is still a Mormon. She questioned multiple aspects of their practice, her local bishop, different things, which I think is very, very bold and brave for anybody to do, but especially somebody who is prone to fawning. And she also is trying to get legislation passed in Utah to regulate family vlogging, even though she has multiple other family members, like aunts and grandparents, who are still vlogging. And so her legislation kind of goes against at least her aunts who still have minor children, and I think that's a really bold and brave thing to do. And so I think Sherry is a great example of how you can kind of have people-pleasing and or fawning tendencies, and you can still really live your convictions and have the courage of your convictions if you choose to. It might be extremely scary for you, but it can be done. And so then by contrast, seeing that Kevin never reached that point until R escaped and Ruby was in prison, and even now he'll still say how much he loved Ruby. It still feels like this wasn't so much a choice that he made. There wasn't a line in the sand that made him wake up and stop trying to appease Ruby. It was instead that this is what the world forced on him. His options really were to completely let his kids go into foster care and potentially never see them again and not have Ruby, or just not have Ruby. Relating to all of this brainwashing stuff, kind of to try to make things as fair as I can for Kevin, he did state that he started to really doubt his sanity starting in July of 2022. So this was 14 months after R escaped. That was about 5 months after Kevin was last featured on the Connections page. At least when I went back and looked at, because the Connections Instagram page is still public, still up. The last video I could find was from around February of 2022. So while there is content out there showing Kevin for a couple of years after Jodi got involved. According to him, it got a lot worse after they quit being on the internet. And so perhaps that lack of access to him, or lack of evidence of what his experiences were like during the time where he was feeling the most brainwashed, is part of the problem. However, that's kind of what I was really expecting from this documentary. I was expecting it to go more into him talking about the real detail about what he was thinking, what he was believing, how he was manipulated, so that we could more deeply understand how detached from reality he got, and how up became down, and that kind of a thing. And the documentary didn't really do that for me. It didn't really give me much more insight into his brainwashing than what I had before. I actually felt like Chad did a better job of giving insight into some of how he was led to believe things that were really outside of the bounds of reason than what Kevin did. That really surprised me, especially because Chad had shared something on Snapchat that he was primarily excited for this documentary because it would help people understand his dad and why his dad wasn't guilty, and that just wasn't my takeaway from this series. One of the things that Chad said that did speak to the brainwashing was that he now realized that he was seeing Jodi essentially as a god. I would think that Ruby and Kevin were as well, and I had kind of suspected that already based on Ruby's journals and stuff that had been released to the public. It sure felt like that was kind of the vibe, was that she either is God or that she is directly communicating to God and is kind of this mouthpiece for how earthlings can be in touch with God. It is my belief that humans are more psychologically frail than most of us realize most of the time. I think that we can be influenced and our beliefs can be changed more easily than most of us want to realize. I do believe in the idea of brainwashing, especially when people are isolated, which was a very clear tactic that Jodi used. She very much isolated her victims. Kevin was in isolation for a whole year. Chad was in isolation for a whole year. Her former victims, Jesse and Adam, repeat those ideas that you have to be in isolation to get closer to God, like to suffer, to kind of come into truth and things like that. And I think that isolation can have a really profound effect on our psychology. Even if I were to just completely concede that yes, Kevin was brainwashed and that is why he bought into all of this, and that is what motivated all of his choices, and that it had nothing to do with not prioritizing protecting his children. I still don't think that that would be a moral excuse for sitting by and abandoning your children while they are being tortured. I think some might argue that, certainly Ruby tried to argue that she was completely brainwashed and that was her whole reasoning. I don't doubt that there was some brainwashing going on for both of them. I think, to me, the question is how much of it was brainwashing and how much of it was their own internal demons that were already there. But to me, even if it was purely brainwashing, that doesn't get rid of the responsibility. I realized that Ruby was hands-on inflicting this pain on her children and also was hands-on with witnessing Jodi inflicting this pain on her children, and Kevin wasn't. But I don't think that brainwashing relieves parents from their responsibility to be the one to step in and protect their children. Perhaps a more common example of this would be in situations where there is an abusive partner. If let's say it's an abusive father or stepfather, if the mother is very much a victim of her spouse and is made to believe that she really has to always keep this man happy in order to be okay or to be accepted or whatever. And that man is harming her children. Her psychology or her wiring being in a place where she thinks she has to appease this man and that she thinks this is her fault or that she just needs to be a better wife to get all of this to stop, doesn't change the fact that it is still on her to protect her child. And if she does not get that child out of that situation, she bears some responsibility. Not as much as the person who is doing the harm, but there is always a degree of responsibility that parents hold to protect their children, regardless of how skewed their thinking becomes or how much trauma they have, what their trauma responses are. At the end of the day, it is just always a parent's responsibility to protect their kids. Final section to bring this all home. There is a big difference between what is abuse and what is criminal abuse, especially for children. If you were to meet with any decent therapist, they would list for you a whole bunch of ways that you could treat a child that should count as abuse and that would cause trauma to a child. These would include things like spanking, things like being screamed at, being insulted, not being given the benefit of the doubt, lacking like routine or consistent emotional support for their own anxieties or fears or sadness. Emotional neglect is harmful to children. And these are just a few. And the vast majority of the ways that children can be abused are legal in America. There is no state in this country where spanking your kids is illegal. A lot of times, even when children are removed by CPS or whatever the equivalent is in different areas, DCFS or etc., the children are usually removed for physical abuse, really severe physical neglect or severe medical neglect, or sexual abuse. The vast majority of the time, emotional and psychological abuse don't register as something that children get removed for by CPS. And even in a vast majority of cases where there is a degree of abuse to where the children end up getting removed from the home, there usually aren't criminal charges. It really takes a lot in this country for people to be criminally charged with child abuse. And I think that is part of what we see in this case, is that CPS was called a whole lot based on what people on YouTube were seeing as abuse. And I think that any good therapist would tell you that, yeah, definitely some of what is on those vlogs is abuse, but it's not something that would get people criminally charged. And that really is the ultimate answer to why isn't Kevin in jail? Why didn't Kevin get in trouble for any of this? It's ultimately because the abuse that we saw on YouTube is not at a criminal level or not at a level that can be charged, where the way that R and E were found was a degree of abuse and neglect that did become criminal, and Kevin wasn't tied to that most extreme form of abuse, and so that's ultimately why he didn't get in trouble. And the other thing that I think is important to consider with situations like this too is when CPS is looking at a family, it's not simply a question of, is this a good home for this child? Or is this child experiencing any trauma from this household? Ultimately, what all of this boils down to is so many people are asking the question, why didn't Kevin get in any trouble? Really, the shortest answer to that question is the abuse that Kevin knew about either wasn't to the criminal level of child abuse or there was no evidence of that. Whereas the crimes that Jodi and Ruby were guilty of and prosecuted for, Kevin was not directly involved with or known to even be aware of. So ultimately, he was just an extremely neglectful and absent father in 2023, and that's the time frame for which the criminal child abuse was happening. Now, in my opinion, the moral and ethical responsibility of a father is a completely different question. What can a person be charged with criminally, and what should a father be responsible for on a moral and ethical level are two vastly different questions. In my opinion, from just an ethical standpoint, he has loads of guilt. My overall takeaway from this documentary was that he was highly codependent on Ruby. He was desperate for her approval and acceptance, almost to the level where it seemed like without her acceptance or approval, he couldn't be okay with himself. Not in like the stereotypical sense where there's like an addiction or a substance involved, but one where Kevin was so insecure with himself that he needed Ruby's approval to just be okay himself. And because of that, that took priority over everything else in his life, including his children. And that really is where the downfall happens, because she was an abusive mother. And if you are prioritizing staying with her and getting her approval when she is harming your children, you are then going to be the ultimate enabler, the ultimate passive, neglectful father, if that is your priority, if that's the way that you organize your priorities when you are with an abusive person. At the same time, the fact that he was that codependent and he was that desperate for Ruby's approval and has now filed for divorce and is seeing the children as innocent in this, despite potentially Ruby still seeing them as the problem or seeing them as possessed or whatever, is a particularly strong step for him. That really would fly in the face of his former beliefs and his former priorities. So, in a way, I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. At the same time, it really isn't much compared to what his children ultimately needed from him. There's this real big gap between where his personal growth is at and what father his children needed. The takeaway that I keep coming back to since watching this documentary is the fact that the most emotional we saw Kevin get in these 3 episodes was when he was reflecting on the good times with Ruby. In that moment, he cried or came the closest to crying out of everything in here. And as a viewer, I cried multiple times, always in relation to the children. But to me, the most emotional was when he was talking about roughly a year before R escaped, when he decided to leave the family home and he said goodbye to each of his children and explained to them that he wasn't going to be back for a while. And he talked about how his youngest, E, was particularly distraught, and his words were that her eyes were pleading. And he saw his youngest child, who was only 8 at the time, needing him to stay. And he left. And that to me is what he has to live with. And what all of his children have to find some way to cope with and heal is that that's who their father was. Their father is the guy who walked away when they needed him most. Kevin made a statement in reference to this that this was another one that made me tear up. His exact line was, "I was the last line of defense for these children, and I packed my bags and walked away." And I think that really is the core of this. That is absolutely traumatic for these kids. It just absolutely has to be. And that was the decision that he made. Whether you want to consider the gaslighting aspect and so many other aspects, that ultimately was still the choice that he made as a 40-something-year-old father of 6. And while he has told the jail that he doesn't want to receive Ruby's letters anymore, and while he has filed for divorce, and while he has fought for and potentially regained custody of the 4 minor children, so he is now prioritizing his children over Ruby, it also still seems clear to me that he still has more of a connection to her or more of a desire for her than what most of us want him to have. I've seen other people upset that he even said that he loved her. That doesn't bother me. I think, of course, he still loves her, or at least loves who she was before or who he thought she was before. I wouldn't expect anybody in a marriage that long to completely lose love for somebody. But the fact that he still gets emotional over remembering her and only gets a little bit emotional when talking about this stuff with the children, that's what really just doesn't sit right with me. That really says to me that he still has a lot of healing to do with codependence type issues or some sort of insecurity, trauma issues of his own that make him that needy for her. And that's sad, but it also seems like they're all in therapy. Even in little E's statement that was read in the Utah House or whatever it was with a bill, some of her statement made it seem clear to me that she's in therapy. Definitely some like kind of therapy talk going on in her statement. I hope that this family keeps leaning into that healing and that they all find ways to come back from this. But also, something to consider is if he were in jail, these 4 minor children would be in foster care. And while Kevin is clearly very imperfect, he knows their brainwashing experience. He knows the experiences, for the most part, of what Ruby did to them. And he's their father at the end of the day. And so my guess is that these kids are very glad that he is not in jail and that they are able to be at home with him. If you've made it this long, I'll tell you a tiny bit about what this channel is going to be, because this was my first video. I'm going to be going down different rabbit holes of different hyperfixations that I have. Some of them will be kind of news stories like this one or true crime type things. Some other stories that have caught my eye in the last several months or year or so have been the Maya Kowalski story on that Take Care of Maya documentary that was on Netflix, the Madeline Soto case, but certainly don't plan to only do stories along those lines. I do have kind of an just interest in Mormonism in general, so I wouldn't be surprised if I end up with more Mormon content. I got married in the fall and got really into kind of the common debates and I guess kind of drama or tea that happens in a lot of wedding planning communities. I found that really fascinating. I've continued to remain in some wedding related advice and planning groups just because it's entertaining to me. So I think I will do a video on that at some point. I also am interested in the subreddit for step parents. As somebody who's doing a healing journey, a lot of therapy stuff comes to mind when I see a lot of the content that gets really popular in that subreddit, so I think I will do a video on that. But also, I just have ADHD, and sometimes I am surprised by what my new fixation becomes. So if you're curious to find out too, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.